Hi guys, welcome back. I wish I could say that this is gonna be a light, cozy video like I usually make, but this one's gonna be pretty heavy. I've had a few requests to talk about Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which I reference constantly because it's been pivotal to my development as a human being, and I figured I'd finally make that video. So this is one of the most profound books, at least for me, on the topic of radical acceptance and meaning making, which the two kind of go hand in hand, as we'll see in this video. If you're not familiar with the book, Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychologist and Holocaust survivor. He spent, I think it was a total of 3 years in camps during World War II. I gotta be careful about what I say since this is YouTube, can't say certain things. And after he was liberated from those camps, he developed what's known as logotherapy, which is a therapy derived from the Greek word logos, which means meaning. The basic gist of the therapy is that our primary need as human beings is to make meaning of our lives. And I think that this book needs to be read, honestly, by everyone. I think it needs to be mandatory, not only to learn about some of the horrific things that have happened in recent history, but also because of the psychological implications of it. I don't know about you, but I know that anytime I speak about the importance of radical acceptance and kind of picking yourself up by the bootstraps, there's always a lot of resistance from people who think that suffering is some sort of competition, that they have it so much worse than everybody else, that they are the only people to have ever truly suffered in life, which I find to be incredibly narcissistic. This book really goes to show that it's actually in the deepest of traumas, the deepest of suffering and oppression, that it's most important to lean on the things that can't be taken away by anyone, which are your attitude, your ability to make meaning, your willingness to take responsibility for the few things that you can control in those situations. So anytime I talk about acceptance or taking responsibility or having an external locus of control, people will say that's fine and dandy for, minor inconveniences. It doesn't really work for the bigger traumas in life. And I completely disagree. And I hope that talking about this book will help you understand why I take that view. So without further ado, let's talk about my main takeaways from Man's Search for Meaning. So Viktor Frankl talks first about kind of the 3 different phases of an inmate's mental reactions to camp life. The first one, he says, is shock. He calls it at first delusions of reprieve, which is when a person has this irrational conviction that's not based on any evidence that they're going to be spared, of kind of irrational hope. And that hope is very protective in the beginning because we need hope in order to survive in a lot of ways. And so in the beginning stages, when it's not clear to the mind how long-lasting something really is, that delusion of hope is there to keep you safe, to keep you going, to keep you moving forward. And then that kind of corrodes over time. And as the shock wears off, you experience this disillusionment and this curiosity rather than conviction about whether things are going to work out okay for you. Then the second stage, according to Frankl, is this period where you start to miss home, you start to miss your old life, your family, you experience disgust with your current circumstances, and basically it's characterized by blunted feelings, which are again meant to protect you. So first there's hope, which is meant to protect you by keeping you going. And once your mind realizes, hey, actually this stressor is here to stay, then your mind switches into blunting that affect because maintaining delusions of hope is no longer helping you survive. He calls it a type of self-numbing or a protective shell. He talks about how there were a lot of daydreaming, daydreaming about comfort, about food, about family. This part I thought was interesting. He's talking about how he was daydreaming about his beloved, who he had only been married to for 9 months at the time of their separation. More and more I felt that she was present, that she was with me. I had the feeling that I was able to touch her, able to stretch out my hand and grasp hers. That feeling was very strong. She was there. Then at that very moment, a bird flew down silently and perched just in front of me on the heap of soil which I had dug up from the ditch and looked steadily at me. I found this to be remarkable because this is not the first nor the second time that I've heard of somebody having a spiritual connection to a bird in a time of grief and loss, feeling like the spirit of their beloved has somehow come to them in the shape of a bird. It's never actually happened to me, but this is a pattern that I've noticed enough times that I think it's important to touch on. And then the third stage, according to Frankl, was the post-liberation stage, which was at first characterized by dissociation and a need to relearn pleasure. Since they didn't have a lot of those comforts for the last 3 years, their body was no longer accustomed to feeling pleasure, and it had to learn how to do that. Now that I think of it, this actually might be behind why sometimes when we feel liberated by a life circumstance, whether it be like you're done with exams, or you are able to move to a different country, or you're able to leave a toxic workplace, there can be a period of distress immediately following that liberation because you're just not used to it. Your body's still learning to adjust. It hasn't quite metabolized those new comforts. Like I remember there was one time, I think during college, when I had just finished exams, and that whole exam week, I was like, I'm going to be so relieved when exams are over, and I'm going to have so much fun, and I'm just going to relax. And then I had my very last exam, and that entire next 24 hours, I was super emotional. I was crying a lot. I didn't know what to do with myself. On a much, much smaller scale, it's a similar phenomenon of like not knowing what to do with yourself when you finally get that thing that you've hoped for so long. Another phenomenon that he noticed post-liberation was some people started what's called identification with the aggressor in psychoanalysis, which is when they go from being the victim to being the aggressor. Frankl says, people with natures of a more primitive kind could not escape the influences of the brutality which had surrounded them in camp life. Now, being free, they thought they could use their freedom licentiously and ruthlessly. They were now the oppressors instead of the oppressed. They became instigators, not objects, of willful force and injustice. They justified their behavior by their own terrible experiences. Again, this is a protective mechanism that the mind uses. When it feels like it has no power in a situation, tries to convince you that actually you relate to the person causing you harm rather than to the victim. And so then when you have a little taste of that power, you become the person causing the harm because you want to make sure that you are never the victim ever again. But for every one of the liberated prisoners, the day comes when, looking back on his camp experiences, he can no longer understand how he endured it all. So there comes a point at which you start to reacclimate to life, you start to learn how to feel pleasure again, and eventually that period of extreme suffering and anguish becomes a little bit foreign to you, becomes a little bit separated from you. Because in the moment you were able to, using your mind's tools, find a way to make meaning and to survive it. But after the fact, you realize just how incredible of a feat that was. And Frankl talked about how there was lots of meaning making in this camp. People were taking up a lot of interest in religion. They were praying a lot. They improvised services. There was a lot of talk of politics. They had a deeper experience of beauty, specifically art and nature. As the inner life of the prisoner tended to become more intense, he also experienced the beauty of art and nature as never before. If someone had seen our faces on the journey from Auschwitz to a Bavarian camp as we beheld the mountains of Salzburg, with their summits glowing in the sunset, through the little barred windows of the prison carriage, he would have never believed that those were the faces of men who had given up all hope of life. Despite that factor, or maybe because of it, we were carried away by nature's beauty, which we had missed for so long. And also they used a lot of humor to cope with things. A lot of people don't know this, but humor is actually a defense mechanism in psychoanalysis. To discover that there was any semblance of art in a concentration camp must be surprise enough for an outsider, but he may be even more astonished to hear that one could find a sense of humor there as well. Of course, only the faint trace of one, and then only for a few seconds or minutes. Humor was another of the soul's weapons in the fight for self-preservation. It is well known that humor, more than anything else in the human makeup, can afford an aloofness and an ability to rise above any situation, even if only for a few seconds. There's a reason why so many comedians are depressed behind the scenes, because the humor is a compensation for what they really feel deep down. And what people choose to joke about can be interesting. What people choose to make light of can be interesting. It might reflect something that they're uncomfortable with. It might also surprise you that there was a lot of gratitude. The meager pleasures of camp life provided a kind of negative happiness, freedom from suffering. In my journaling workbooks, you will notice that one of the components that I talk about gratitude having is this kind of negative happiness, this freedom from suffering. Being grateful that something that could have gone wrong didn't go wrong. Or being grateful that a moment of pain has ended. So all of these are ways that we can cope when life throws terrible things in our direction. Gratitude, appreciating the beauty of life, humor, spirituality. Now remember at the beginning of this video, I talked about how some people seem to think that suffering is a contest. Listen to what Frankl says. A man's suffering is similar to the behavior of gas. If a certain quantity of gas is pumped into an empty chamber, it will fill the chamber completely and evenly, no matter how big the chamber. Thus, suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative. You wouldn't expect somebody who has experienced arguably the biggest form of suffering to say something like that, but I think that it's true. I think that we talk a lot about how certain people who have privilege must have it so good. They must never experience any sort of suffering. I think that that's frankly childish to think. None of us are spared from suffering. None of us are spared from the pains of life. None of us don't deserve compassion just because on the surface their suffering seems to be so much smaller. One of the parts that stuck out to me the most in this book is the idea that no matter what is taken away from you, one thing that can never be taken away is your attitude, your mental facilities. The experiences of camp life show that man does have a choice. Apathy could be overcome, irritability suppressed. Man can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible conditions of psychic and physical stress. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's way. Every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threaten to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you would become the plaything of circumstance. Fundamentally, therefore, any man can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall be overcome of him, mentally and spiritually. It is the spiritual freedom, which cannot be taken away, that makes life meaningful and purposeful. He talks also about the concept of what would later be known many decades later as post-traumatic growth. One could make victory of those experiences, turning life into an inner triumph, or one could ignore the challenge and simply vegetate, as did a majority of the prisoners. Remember in a previous video I talked about alchemizing pain, turning pain into beauty, into art, into meaning, into something good. That is essentially what post-traumatic growth is. It's alchemy. And he talked also about how loss of hope can be deadly. The prisoner who had lost faith in the future, his future, was doomed. Usually began with the prisoner refusing one morning to get dressed and wash, or to go out on the parade grounds. No entreaties, no blows, no threats had any effect. He just lay there, hardly moving. The sudden loss of hope and courage can have a deadly effect. And this is hard because when we think about things like depression, one of the symptoms is loss of hope. But which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is the depression born of the hopelessness, or is the hopelessness a symptom of the depression? I don't know yet. What do you think? More on taking responsibility. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for the individual. For us, the meaning of life embraced the wider cycles of life and death, of suffering and of dying. So that's the first chunk of Man's Search for Meaning, is talking about his experience in the camp. And then the second part is talking about logotherapy and gives a little bit of a rundown into what logotherapy is. Like I said, according to logotherapy, the primary drive of human beings is to make meaning of life. What I love about this chapter is that Frankl discusses how a happy, healthy life is not devoid of tension. In order to be existentially healthy, you have to have a little bit of tension. You have to have something that you're working towards, or some sort of friction between your current life and your ideal life. Man's search for meaning may arouse inner tension rather than inner equilibrium. However, precisely such tension is an indispensable prerequisite of mental health. In the words of Nietzsche, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. Mental health is based on a certain degree of tension, the tension between what one has already achieved and what one still ought to accomplish, or the gap between what one is and what one should become. That's why, I don't know about you, but when I feel like I don't really desire anything in life, like I'm sitting down to journal, maybe for the full moon, the new moon, whatever, and I don't really have anything that I want, I don't have a goal to set, it doesn't feel good. I prefer having that tension of something I don't yet have, something to work for. Because we're not created to be these vegetative people that are just super happy and at peace all the time. There is a little bit of excitement and of human vitality and of life in having something that's not yet accomplished. Also, I love his take that there is no universal meaning of life. It really depends on a person's individual values. The meaning of life differs from man to man, from day to day, and from hour to hour. What matters, therefore, is not the meaning of life in general, but rather the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. I've spoken before about how I don't think values are static. I think that our values change even over the course of, say, a quarter. That's why in my journaling workbooks, you'll find that you still need to reflect on your values even the following quarter, because, again, they change. They're dynamic. It's situational. He also discusses how everything is transient. This is something that Freud also touched on, this idea that even beauty, even happiness, everything good has a ticking clock, and at some point it's going to end. And I think I used to really struggle with this when I was younger. I didn't understand why something can't be forever if it's good, but I wasn't honoring the cyclical nature of life when I saw things that way. Recently, I actually had this brief existential moment where I realized that this is the youngest I will ever be. And from here on forward, my life is just getting shorter and shorter by the second. And I had just this moment of panic of oh my God, what am I going to do? Because I love to grow. I love to develop. I love for things to get bigger, not smaller. So the idea that things are only going to get smaller from here for me is terrifying. And then I read over this. Listen up. The pessimist resembles a man who observes with fear and sadness that his wall calendar, from which he daily tears a sheet, grows thinner with each passing day. On the other hand, the person who attacks the problems of life actively is like a man who removes each successive leaf from his calendar and files it neatly and carefully away with its predecessors, after first having jotted down a few diary notes on the back. He can reflect with pride and joy on all the richness set down in these notes, on all the life he has already lived to the fullest. Then Frankl touches on how pleasure should not be the goal in life. Pleasure is the byproduct. That's why when people lean too much into hedonism, they're kind of numbing the pleasure, because when you constantly pursue pleasure all the time, you need more and more of it. Whereas instead, you should be deriving pleasure from something else that gives you meaning. For example, something that gives me a lot of pleasure is writing. But I don't set out to write oh, this is going to feel so good. I set out to write with the mindset of, I want to publish this book. I want to tell this story. Pleasure should be a byproduct, not the goal. And lastly, Viktor Frankl believed that everybody is self-deterministic, meaning you are not a slave to your neurology or circumstances or anything else in life. You get to determine what you're going to do with your life. Man is not fully conditioned and determined, but rather determines himself whether he gives in to conditions or stands up to them. In other words, man is ultimately self-determining. Man does not simply exist, but always decides what his existence will be, what he will become in the next moment. Let me know your thoughts. I hope you have a nice rest of your week, and I'll see you soon.